February 1964, Gabon. The president has just been removed by his own army. His own people are in the streets, and they're not mourning him. They're celebrating. For about 24 hours, Gabon runs itself. Then, the planes come. French paratroopers drop into the capital. They don't ask permission, they don't hold a vote, they march to the palace, push the new government aside, and put the old president back in his chair like nothing happened. No election, no debate, just troops and the man France preferred returned to power by force. That was the loud version of control, the version with boots and rifles and a flag. Here's the part nobody tells you. France figured out it didn't need any of that. By 1960, 14 French colonies in Africa had become independent countries. New flags, new anthems, seats at the United Nations. On paper, free. And France kept almost all of it anyway. The money, the oil, the uranium, the loyalty, without stationing an army to do it. Because here's the thing about that famous year of independence. The occupation didn't end in 1960, it just went invisible. The soldiers walked out the front door. The currency stayed, the companies stayed, the language stayed, the schools that train every future leader stayed. And the men at the top got paid, handsomely, to keep it all exactly where France wanted it. No tank, no flag, no bars on the window, and still, nobody gets out. That's the real trick, and it's the question this whole video is built around. How do you occupy a country without a single soldier? How do you build a cage with no bars, no lock you can even see, no guard at the gate, and somehow keep everyone inside it for 60 years? For 6 decades, almost nobody dared test it. Then, 3 of the poorest countries on Earth tried to walk out and found out exactly how deep the cage really goes. By the late 1950s, holding on to colonies had quietly become a losing deal for France. The calculation was brutal. When you run a colony, you pay for all of it. The roads, the schools, the soldiers, the endless layers of bureaucracy. And you answer for every famine and every uprising that comes with it. France had just been bled by a humiliating defeat in Indochina and an even uglier war in Algeria, and the cost of empire, measured in money and in lives, had become almost impossible to defend at home. So in 1960, France did something that looked, from the outside, remarkably generous. It granted independence to 14 African colonies in a single year. But that independence came wrapped in paperwork. Buried inside all the ceremony were the cooperation agreements, the defense pacts that let French troops stay or return whenever they liked. The agreement granted first claim on strategic resources like oil and uranium, permanent military bases, and a currency controlled by France. The architect of all this was a man most people have never heard of, Jacques Foccart. From a discreet office inside the presidential palace, he ran an entire continent's worth of French policy through back channels, personal favors, and a web of well-placed friends. Presidents came and went over the decades. Foccart's machine outlasted every one of them. None of it was charity, it was cold calculation. For a fraction of what a real occupation would have cost, France locked in cheap raw materials, 14 dependable votes at the United Nations, and a strip of strategic ground stretching clear across the Sahara. The flag changed, the grip didn't. It was decolonization only on paper. In reality, France still controlled the most important pillars of these states. But a deal written on paper is only as strong as everyone's willingness to honor it. So France made sure that walking away was never a real option. It built 4 locks, and the first one was sitting in everybody's pocket. Picture this: your country uses a currency it doesn't control. It can't set its own interest rates, it can't print its own banknotes, and the exchange rate is fixed somewhere far away by people who answer to no one inside your borders. That's not a thought experiment. That's the CFA franc. And 14 African nations still use it to this day in 2026. It's pegged to the euro at a rate that has barely moved in decades, 655.96 to 1, precise right down to the decimal. And for most of its history, member states had to keep a share of their national reserves parked in the French treasury. Think about what that means. A country that can't run its own money can't really run its own economy. And if walking away from the currency would collapse that economy overnight, walking away stops being a real choice at all. On paper, the exit is wide open. In practice, taking it is a form of financial self-harm. That's the first lock. The second lock is ownership. For decades, the most valuable pieces of these economies, the crown jewels, ran straight through French hands. The uranium flowed through a French nuclear company now known as Orano. The oil moved through Total Energies. And the ports and railways, the arteries everything else depends on, were run by a French conglomerate called Bolloré. The third lock is the language itself. French is the language of the government, the courts, the contracts, and the jobs worth having. If you can't speak it fluently, the door to real power never opens. And the fourth lock is the one that makes the others permanent: education. The people destined to become the ministers, the generals, the central bankers are shaped in French schools, on French curricula, and many finish their training in Paris itself. They come home thinking in the language of the people who taught them. So the dependence doesn't just survive from one government to the next, it quietly reproduces itself, handed down like an inheritance to the generation behind. 4 locks, and not one of them looks anything like a wall. But stack them together and you get a country that is perfectly free to leave and simply can't afford to. Still, even the most elegant cage needs someone to rule it, and France found a class of men more than happy to hold the keys. Now, every story about exploitation has a part that's harder to explain: the people who benefited from the inside. Why on earth would the Africans in charge defend it? The answer is that France never relied on force alone to keep this thing running. It paid people generously to keep it running on its behalf. In exchange for loyalty, a whole class of rulers received something money usually can't buy: permanent power. Paris backed them, financed them, and quietly shielded them from anyone who tried to push them out, and so they stayed. Not for a term, for lifetimes. The numbers are almost hard to believe. Omar Bongo ran Gabon for around 41 years. Gnassingbé Eyadema held Togo for nearly 38. Blaise Compaoré ran Burkina Faso for 27. Idriss Déby controlled Chad from 1990 until his rule ended in 2021. And Paul Biya has led Cameroon since 1982, re-elected yet again in October 2025, at 92 years old, in a vote his own opponent dismissed as a masquerade. That's a grip on power longer than most of his citizens have been alive. Some of them didn't even bother changing the family name. When Bongo's time ran out, his son Ali slid into the chair. When Eyadema's did, his son Faure stepped in and is still there today. Power passed down like a family business. None of this was the system breaking down. This was the system working exactly as designed. A loyal strongman keeps the oil flowing, the votes coming, and the cage locked, and in return, he gets to rule for the rest of his life. But there was a twist France never planned for. When you clamp a lid on a country for 40 years, the pressure underneath doesn't go away, it builds. And without meaning to, these propped up rulers were raising the very generation that would one day come for them. We'll get to that. First, you need to see what France did to the leaders who forgot who they worked for. Since 1960, France has sent its military into Africa more than 50 times. 50! That isn't a country responding to the occasional emergency, that's a country actively managing a portfolio. And the logic behind those interventions almost never changed. Cooperate and France protects you. Step out of line and France removes you. You can see both halves of that bargain in 2 snapshots. The protection looked like Gabon in 1964, when French paratroopers dropped in and set a friendly president back on his throne. The removal looked like Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, when a leader lost an election and refused to step down, until French forces helped pull him out of a bunker and hand him over to be arrested. And when Paris wanted something done that an official army couldn't be seen doing, it didn't always use its own soldiers. It used men like Bob Denard, a freelance mercenary who toppled governments for hire across the continent, leaving France with clean hands and exactly the outcome it wanted. The loyalty this system bred ran so deep that it followed these rulers all the way back to France itself. Take Jean Bedel Bokassa, the ruler of the Central African Republic, who crowned himself emperor in a ceremony so lavish it nearly bankrupted his own country. His rule turned so brutal that the details are best left to the history books. And France backed him anyway. for years. Then, Bokassa made the mistake of handing the French president Giscard d'Estaing a personal gift of diamonds. When that surfaced in 1979, it helped wreck Giscard's career and cost him the next election. And Bokassa himself? France simply removed him in one tidy operation and installed a replacement. Made him, broke him, same hand. The money ran through the same hidden channels. For years, the French state oil company ELF operated as a giant slush fund, greasing African leaders and French politicians at the same time. And the personal fortunes those leaders skimmed off the top didn't always stay buried. French courts eventually came after the mansions and the supercars, and in 2017, a Paris court convicted the son of one ruling family over a pile of assets he could never have earned honestly. For 60 years, the machine just hummed along. Reward a friend, remove a rival, and keep the resources flowing. And then, in the poorest and most overlooked corner of the entire system, 3 countries finally decided to test whether the cage was actually real. Between 2020 and 2023, a wave of military takeovers rolled across the Sahel, the dry band of land just below the Sahara. Mali, then Burkina Faso, then Niger. One after another, soldiers seized power, and every single one of them rode in on the same promise. France out. And they meant it. They expelled French troops, tore up the old defense agreements, and burned French flags in the streets. They formed their own alliance and stormed out of the regional bloc. In the space of 3 short years, the most aggressively anti-France governments in 6 decades had all come to power at once. And France's military pillar didn't just crack under the strain, it collapsed. By 2025, the bases were simply gone. France handed back its base in Chad in January, its last base in Côte d'Ivoire in February, and its final base in Senegal that summer. After more than 60 years, France's entire military footprint across West and Central Africa had shrunk to almost nothing. The guards were gone, so the prisoners walked free, right? Not quite, because throwing out the guards was never the same thing as opening the lock. What these regimes actually did was swap one warden for another. Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group, now operating under the Kremlin's Africa Corps, moved in to provide the muscle France used to provide. And Chinese money moved in to take over the economy. Belt and Road loans, power plants, and a multi-billion-dollar pipeline that has become Niger's only way to sell its oil to the world. Different patron, same dependence. And here's the detail that gives the whole game away. They kept the currency. The very regimes that expelled the soldiers, shredded the treaties, and burned the flag are to this day still using the CFA franc, still pegged to the euro at that same unmoving number. They've announced plans for a sovereign currency of their own. They've even given it a name. But as of early 2026, it still doesn't exist. They threw out the guards, but the lock never moved. And that, at last, brings us back to the question we started with. So, how exactly do you occupy a country without a single soldier? You do it the way France did. You make the visible occupation disappear, and you replace it with something nobody can shoot at. You hand over the flag, but keep the currency. You give up the palace, but keep the oil, the uranium, and the ports. You let people write their own laws, in your language, interpreted by elites you trained yourself. And then you pay the men at the very top to guard the whole arrangement for as long as they live. The army was never the real occupation. The army was just the part everyone could see. The real occupation was the currency, the corporations, the language, the schools, and the quiet corruption at the highest levels of government. And when you strip the soldiers away, every last piece of that is still standing. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger proved it. 3 of the poorest countries on Earth did the hardest and most dangerous thing imaginable. They threw out the guards. And they're still inside the cage because the guards were never the thing keeping them there. It's worth being careful about what that actually means. The lesson isn't that breaking free dooms a country to fall apart, or that any of these places were better off under the old arrangement. The point is narrower and sharper than that. Throwing out the soldiers turned out to be the easy part. It was always the easy part. The cage that truly holds, the one built from currency and debt and dependence, was never even unlocked. Which leaves a single question hanging over the entire continent. The guards have been chased off, and the whole world can see it. But the real lock, the invisible one, made of money and habit, the one nobody can photograph, has held firm for 60 years. The day someone finally picks it is the day the occupation is truly over, and everyone is still waiting to find out if that day will ever come. Here's what I want to know from you. Do you think any of these countries will ever fully break free, or is the invisible cage unbreakable? Drop your comment down below. Thank you, and see you in the next video.